Hello, it's Arran Johnston here at the Battle of Prestonpans Museum in sunny East Lothian. And today I'm bringing you The Rebel Next Door, a presentation which was first given live at the museum as part of the 2025 Jacobite Festival. It's informed by research we've been doing at the museum here as part of our Beyond the Battle project, which is sponsored by Historic Environment Scotland. And as you would expect, the Beyond the Battle project aims to look beyond just the events and people of the battle itself and tries to investigate the context in which it was fought, by which I mean the landscape and the people of our 18th century community here around the Prestonpans battlefield. Now, I'm going to begin with a quotation from the memoirs of Alexander Carlyle. He's a very useful source because he grew up in Prestonpans most of his childhood and young adulthood. He was the son of the minister of Prestonpans Church. He went on, of course, to be the minister at Inveresk Church, just down the road at Musselburgh. So he was never far from this community. He knew it very well and the people within it. He was also a partisan, as many people were during the course of the campaign, of course. He'd offered his services to Lieutenant General Sir John Cope, having also joined the volunteers in Edinburgh before the city's capitulation. An interesting guy, a relevant and useful guide to our 18th century community. And he says this: many people in East Lothian at that time were Jacobites, and they were most forward in mixing with the soldiers. This is during General Cope's march from Dunbar across to Haddington and from there to the battlefield at Prestonpans, where he was complaining that too many civilians were allowed to mix and chat with the soldiers on the march. The commons in general, he says, as well as 2/3 of the gentry at that period, had no aversion to the family of Stuart. Now, it's hard for us to know exactly what he means in terms of these figures. He's obviously talking in generalities. He seems to be, however, I think, referring specifically to East Lothian. But it is difficult to imagine that 2/3 of the gentry were Jacobite supporters, considering how few, comparatively speaking, soldiers from East Lothian made up the Jacobite army. So we're going to use this as our starting point. What do we really know about the sympathies of the people who lived in the area around our battlefield? As is often the case with historical research, it's easier to find evidence and information and clues as to the motivations of those who are better off. But maybe that'll help us because Carlyle has particular concerns about the loyalty of the gentry. So using the lovely map that we have behind us here from the National Library of Scotland, let's have a look at what we know about who lives in this environment. Let's start then over in the west at Dromore House. Here's Hugh Dalrymple, Lord Dromore, and he was part of a large, influential family right across eastern Midlothian. And the Dalrymples were very much committed to the government cause, very unlikely to have much truck with the Jacobite cause. Now, Dalrymple's house at Dromore that still stands today is not the one that was there in 1745. He was just in the process of upgrading his estates with agricultural improvements, and in the next decade will rebuild the house itself. He's influential, but not the most influential member of the family. He is a law lord from Edinburgh. This is very much his country seat, and as I say, not likely to be interested in the Jacobites being triumphant. In fact, he is amongst those who first cite the Jacobite approach to Prestonpans and reports on their movements to General Cope as he's bringing his army into the battlefield area. So he's proactively against the Jacobites. So in our search for Jacobite sympathisers, we can certainly rule him out. His near neighbour is William Grant, Lord Preston Grange. Now, he's also recently moved into the area, purchasing the Preston Grange estates and starting to make a number of changes and improvements there. He's another law lord, and he is very much committed to the government also. Publishes a rebuttal to the Prince's Manifesto, and he becomes Lord Advocate in 1746. So in our search for Jacobite sympathisers around Prestonpans, we can rule him out too. Over at Bankton House, then, on the boundary between the parishes of Prestonpans and Tranent, there is Colonel James Gardner. He's also pretty aligned with the government, having been a career soldier since his boyhood. He is now full colonel of the 13th Dragoons, and the 13th Dragoons are in the army of Lieutenant General Sir John Cope, and Gardner is with them. So he is actively in the field at the Battle of Prestonpans, and of course any of you who know the story or have seen my previous presentation about him will know that he becomes the highest ranking casualty of the battle at Prestonpans. So the Gardners of Bankton, very much not on a list of potential Jacobite sympathisers. We can add to that the ministers from the churches in the area. I don't have portraits, unfortunately, of the two ministers at Prestonpans and Tranent, but they were definitely supporting the government. I've shown you there in their place Alexander Carlisle, who I've already mentioned, the son of Reverend Carlisle at Prestonpans. Carlisle had trained with the militia in 1715 to oppose the Jacobites and supported his son Alexander's decision to do the same in 1745. And Reverend Cunningham, I have shown a detail there of General Blakeney's sketch plan of the Battle of Prestonpans drawn at Stirling, based on information provided by Reverend Cunningham. So the churches here very much in support of the government. In fact, the very eastern edge of the battlefield falls into a third parish, which is Gladsmuir, and the minister at Gladsmuir parish, William Robertson, was also actively pro-government and had, like Alexander Carlisle, tried to volunteer to the defence of Edinburgh as well. So the churches are pretty much sewn up. Will not look for Jacobite sympathisers there either. Whilst we're in Tranent, let's think about the Vallancers. They possessed a Tranent Tower. There's a nice old photograph of it there in its ruinous state. And the Vallancers seem very much to have been supporters of the government too. The clue to that is the fact that they had a baby in 1746, and that baby was christened as William Cumberland Vallance. Named after the Duke of Cumberland, of course, and so as a statement of support, the naming of that baby seems to suggest the sympathies of the Vallancers were pretty clearly hostile to the Jacobites too. We continue our journey around the map then to Seaton and to Kirkensey and Port Seaton. Slightly less tangible, but here we see the influence of a big business. This is the York Buildings Company who bought the forfeited estates of the Earls of Seaton and Winton. The Winton estates, including their coal mining operations near Tranent and their salt panning operations on the coast, and of course the great but now derelict Seaton Palace. They very much pro-government, tied into the government, but financially having a hard time, suffering as so many big companies did after the South Sea bubble, and not making these estates pay as efficiently as they had once hoped. They are leasing out large sections of the land, including to Cadell, who is running the salt operation at Kirkensey by this point. So we can't perhaps look for natural Jacobite sympathisers in the areas that are dependent for their livelihoods on the company that is so bound up in the Hanoverian establishment. Now, to complete the picture, we would naturally move back in to Preston House in the centre of our map to the MP for Stirlingshire, Lord Grange. But we can't really look here for a loyal supporter of the government. And here we get our first indication of somebody who might well have Jacobite sympathies or connections. Now, I've spoken about Lord Grange previously and at length, so please, if you want to know more about Preston House and you want to know this story in more detail, go and explore and watch that video there. But he is worth us spending a little bit of time on again here. Because Lord Grange is the younger brother of the Earl of Mar, John Erskine, who had led the Jacobites in 1715, be a red flag, and through much of his career, Lord Grange had suffered from accusations of potential disloyalty and Jacobite sympathy. And he does have a habit of keeping some slightly Jacobite-leaning company, perhaps. Here's Lord Lovat, who we know visited Lord Grange and spent time in Prestonpans and Preston in 1743. and was involved in the notorious kidnapping of Lord Grange's wife, with his consent, I should say. As I say, all of that previously covered in another video. But it's perhaps not surprising that Lord Grange was considered with some suspicion. Not least because in the 1740s there was correspondence crossing the seas to the Royal Stuarts in exile. Here's a letter in the Stuart papers in the Royal Collection from James Francis Stuart, the would-be King James III and VIII, to Lord Grange, saying, "I am told that it will be agreeable to you to hear directly from myself." So clearly the Jacobites considered Lord Grange to be a Jacobite sympathiser. Now, references here from the summer of 1745 referring to Lord Erskine, again from Jacobite correspondence, suggesting that they certainly considered him a potential supporter, if not an assured one. Lord Grange doesn't, in fact, come out in 1745 because he believes the Prince's gamble is too much of a gamble. In fact, he is referred to there in that second letter from September, just before the Battle of Prestonpans, amongst others in England, suggesting that really, unless the French come over to make certain of the outcome, it's too much of a gamble. Lord Grange, as I say, stays in London during the course of the war, so he doesn't declare for the Jacobite cause, but that, I think, may more be about his calculation than about his sympathies. Which means I am going to put him down not as one of our Red Circle government friends, but as a potential Jacobite, perhaps one of those members of the gentry that Alexander Carlyle was thinking about. Carlyle, of course, and his father both knew Lord Grange very well. So perhaps it is fitting that one of the last surviving tangible vestiges of the lost house at Preston House is a pair of suspiciously Jacobite-looking carved roses that have been incorporated into a later wall nearby. So having painted so far a picture of a community that looks very much dominated by pro-government, pro-Hanoverian supporters, we're going to make it a little bit more complicated, because all of the names listed here are the people accused in what is called the list of persons concerned in the rebellion as having supported the Jacobites. Now, this big list was a database compiled by Customs and Excise officers, county by county, in 1746, collating all of the information about who was accused of supporting the Jacobites. Now, as always with these things, and this is a dogging issue throughout the study of Jacobitism, there's a lot to be discussed about where sympathy tips over to support, and particularly into proactive military support. It's very difficult to gauge the sympathies of people at a time of civil unrest when there were such penalties for being open in your political leanings. Nevertheless, these were all people who were collected on the local lists and accused of supporting the Jacobite army. So what do we know about these people? Well, let's take a first glance. There's a couple over there in the west from Westpans. There's a larger group, a considerably larger group from Prestonpans itself. Another grouping around Cockenzie, slightly inland from the small village at Seaton. There's a couple. There's one right in the centre there, James Dods. We're going to come back to him. He might not live right in this spot, but he farms the land on which the battlefield is fought. And then if we move up the ridge to Trinent, we have three names there, and slightly outside, Robert Anderson, who I'll come back to as well. That's a reasonable amount of people. It's by no means representative of a majority of the people who lived here, but it is quite a large list. What do we know about all of these people? But before we go any further, let's just think for a moment about what the opportunity was. How would those people have joined the Jacobites or supported them? Well, for a start, they've got the obvious opportunity. On the 20th and 21st of September, the Jacobite army is physically here in the battlefield space, in the landscape, and of course victorious in the battle, which means that there are opportunities to join immediately in the aftermath of the battle, even if you haven't actually taken part in it. But that isn't just the end. One of the things we have to remember is that during the aftermath of the battle, when the Jacobite army had quite considerable freedom of movement around large parts of Scotland, the Jacobites did come back in and out of the area. And just a single example of this is in the journal of Captain John Maclean, and there he says, the 19th of October, we were ordered again, especially me, by Lord George Murray to go after MacLachlan to Prestonpans, where I went according to orders, and continued there until the 25th of October. And by further orders from court, we went to Haddington to raise the excise, and stayed there until the 30th. So I cite that as an example because it gives you an idea of Maclean's men and MacLachlan's moving around East Lothian in and out of communities, making repeat visits, doing things like raising the excise, collecting taxes for the Jacobite cause. So plenty of opportunities for contact with the Jacobites, plenty of opportunities for Jacobites to recruit you if you showed an interest. To our list then of potentially people showing an interest, what I'm going to do first, though, is separate out, based on the information on the list of persons concerned, those who are actually accused of having fought with the Jacobite army, by which I mean people who actually served in the ranks of the Jacobite army. I've put those in blue bold, and you can see that actually that is a minority of the people who are listed. Let's put them to one side for a moment and look at who we've got left. Now, I've reshuffled this a little bit to give you the information that was recorded in terms of their occupations. John Berry, James Cairns, Charles Irvine, John Laurie, Samuel Porteous, Thomas Redpath, William Rennie, Andrew Sheriff, William Sinclair, and John Waddle at Prestonpans. All of those were involved in some way in the salt industry. Andrew Sheriff as the brewer and maltster, and John Waddle as the shipmaster, they stand out. But what they are accused of doing for the Jacobites is supporting the collection of salt taxes. So even though there are exceptions, they are involved in the collection of those salt taxes. So salt is dominating our attention here at Prestonpans. Look at the two down there from Westpans too, Robert Angus and John Finlayson, also both involved in the salt industry. Let's jump up to Kirkensey then, in the top right. Charles Cruikshanks, Robert Crichton, William Mackenzie, William Mitchell, James Reed, all involved in the salt industry. The exception up there on the heights at Tranent is Robert Penston, the gardener. Not a lot of salt being produced up there on the hilltop, admittedly, but he does stand out as the exception. So these people are all involved or are accused of being involved in 1745 with the collection of the salt duties for the Jacobite army. So this isn't actively going out in the field and fighting for them. Is it indicative of Jacobite sympathy? Or were they coerced? We don't know. But let's dig a little bit deeper into what we're starting to find out about the involvement of the salt industry in this phase of the Jacobite Rising. Now, our best lead in this area is George Cheap, who was the collector of His Majesty's Customs for Prestonpans in 1745, and thankfully some of his records are still available to us. They are in the National Archives in Edinburgh, and as part of this project I've been along to unfold them, have a look at them, and make what sense I can of them. Now, George Cheap is an interesting guy. We don't know exactly where he lived in Prestonpans, but we have found evidence that later in the 18th century, the Customs House owned the land immediately behind the gates shown in the photograph there, just along the road from Harlaw Hill House. And so it's possible, although I can't say for sure, that if the Customs House was down there in the 1780s, maybe it was there in the 1740s. Maybe George Cheap came through those gates we're looking at. What we do know is that he was a pretty influential, well-placed and wealthy fellow, son of the Laird of Rossi, as you can see there, and members of his family were involved in trade and captaining vessels out on mercantile expeditions, and so, as I say, a well-connected and wealthy fellow. He's married to Mary Wedderburn, whose family was from Gosford, just along the coast here in East Lothian. And her cousin, just as an incidental but quite interesting connection, was Lieutenant Colonel Peter Halkett. And Halkett was serving on the field of Prestonpans, survived, surrendered, and was later killed at the Battle of Monongahela some 10 years on. But nevertheless, clearly indicative of the loyalty of the family that he's there, leading his men into battle against the Jacobites. Other things we know of George is that he had at least one son, Thomas Cheap, who went on the Grand Tour in the 1750s, and according to Alexander Carlyle's eye, he also had two beautiful daughters. Cheap's house must have been a fine one, a fairly large one, because it accommodated 23 wounded British officers after the Battle of Prestonpans. Anyway, enough of the backstory. What does he tell us about the salt collection in 1745? I know it's the question you're all eager to see answered. Well, the striking thing is that in the period from just after the Battle of Prestonpans down through to the end of 1745, so the period in which the Jacobites are largely in control of this part of Scotland, the salt tax revenues fall by virtually a half. And they do not recover in the first quarter of 1746 either. So there's major disruption to the industry caused by this conflict, clearly. George Cheap himself, in his correspondence, refers to it as the interruption of business by the rebels. What we can't infer simply from the accounts is whether this disruption is due to the fact that workers simply aren't able to operate, that workers aren't coming into work, or that too many of them have joined the Jacobites and have headed off, or whether the Jacobites and their supporters are colluding to ensure that the revenues are not collected by the government, and some of them indeed are sent over to the Jacobites. There's all sorts of known unknowns there. One of the things that we are told by George Cheap is that between September and December 1745, he believes the Jacobites collected in revenues from Prestonpans around £40. It's nothing like the shortfall that is showing in his accounts, but nevertheless it's an attempt, as he was instructed to do by the comptroller in Edinburgh, to try and account for not only what was collected, but also what was collected by the Jacobites. And very interestingly, in April 1746, when the campaign is coming to its close and heading towards the final Jacobite defeat at Culloden, the comptroller in Edinburgh, Richard Gardner, writes to George Cheap and says, "We do not think it equitable to charge the salt officers with the balances forced from them by the rebels. But it must be carefully distinguished whether it was done by force or by the connivance of the officers." Clearly, the loyalty of the salt officers in this area were considered extremely suspect. Whether the Jacobites were able to gain revenues from these taxes to help support their campaign because of the loyalties or sympathies of the salt collectors themselves is, of course, difficult to assess. The fact that so many of them were listed in the list of persons concerned, though, and that Cheap was instructed to have these investigations, does suggest that it was certainly considered a factor. Other factors may simply include the disruption to the business, the fact that people aren't considering the situation stable enough to be manufacturing, or maybe they're just taking advantage of the confusion and the disorder to make sure that more of the salt is kept off books than on. Smuggling, of course, of salt in this part of the country would be no new thing. So there are some known unknowns, but there is certainly evidence of significant disruption, and certainly the suggestion that the government was concerned about the collusion of salt workers in either denying the revenues to the government or actively funneling them off to the Jacobites. There's also a really interesting reference in the Caledonian Mercury during the period of the Jacobite occupation in Edinburgh, specifically commending the people of this community for their zeal in collecting these salt taxes, more or less saying that they're more comfortable collecting taxes for their lawful king and his prince, of course, than they were collecting them on behalf of a big corporation based in London, like the York Buildings Company. But are these involvements or potential involvement of salt workers in the collection of Jacobite salt duties indicative of wider support or indicative of a sort of legacy sympathy inherited from the old Seton estates? Or were they simply coerced into it and forced to do it by Jacobite agents? We still don't really know. What I don't seem to have found yet, and there's always more to find, and always a possibility that we just haven't looked hard enough or long enough, don't seem to have found anything to suggest that any of these people suffered any serious penalties afterwards. Does that mean that they weren't colluding with the Jacobites? Or does it mean that Hugh Cheap and those who are trying to make everything work again after the war is over were simply trying to smooth the community back together? But as none of these were accused of actually fighting with the Jacobites or marching with the Jacobite army, let's strip them out and go back to those who were. And when you do that, this is, of course, a much less impressive list, much fewer. And here we have William Brown and John Dick from Prestonpans, a salt officer and a butcher. James Dods, who I've mentioned before, as the tenant farmer who's farming the area where the battle was actually fought. John Anderson, a wright, and Christopher Ramsay, a labourer from the small village at Seton. It is a small village. It's highly unlikely that these two men didn't know each other. And then we've got Henry Davidson, a mason, and Alexander Henderson there, a small landowner at Tranent. Robert Anderson from a bit further off. So what do we know about these gentlemen? Not a lot is the answer in many cases, but where we do have some information, especially what they're accused of in the list of persons concerned, here it is. We'll start with those over at Seton. So John Anderson, he was accused of joining the Jacobite army after the Battle at Prestonpans, but staying with them all the way through to the Battle of Culloden. He's, according to the information available to the compilers of the list, he had fled the country, and trying to cross-reference him and find him in local records, we think we have him as born on the 27th of May 1704 to James and Isabel Anderson. He doesn't appear in the prisoner lists as far as I can tell, and so he may seem to have got away with it. I haven't picked him up in later life in the area, but we may well do. Seton Village, incidentally, is cleared in the 1780s, completely removed as the landscape is changed down here. His neighbour, Christopher Ramsay, then, he is also accused of joining the Jacobite army in between the Battle of Prestonpans and the march into England, so any time in that 6-week period, perhaps, and also of continuing with them until they dispersed, so staying with them right through into the aftermath of Culloden, and also having fled the country. And so, although we're working on very small amounts of information, you do perhaps get the idea of these two neighbours going through the campaign together, perhaps even finding their way out of the campaign together. Moving up the hill to Tranent, then, we have a slightly different partnership. We have Henry Davidson, who's accused of being with the Jacobites at Prestonpans battle. So different, as I say, accused of actually participating with them, perhaps because the Jacobite army has come through Tranent physically before coming down onto the battlefield. He supported them. Interestingly, though, he's also accused of being in Elcho's regiment. Elcho's Lifeguards were one of the elite regiments of the Jacobite army, a cavalry regiment, uniformed gentlemen. And Elcho is really commissioned to set that regiment up after the Battle of Prestonpans, or pretty much immediately afterwards, on the field, after it was discovered that there had been nobody responsible for Charles Edward's security during the fighting. So maybe he was simply the first man to come forwards in the wake of the battle without being attached to a regiment, and so was immediately swept up in that enthusiasm. Who knows? We might come back to the fact that he's in Elcho's Lifeguards a little bit later. Alexander Henderson, though, he is accused of, with a level of detail that has a ring of truth, therefore, of having conducted the Jacobites on the most advantageous way through Trinent the night before the Battle of Prestonpans, for which he received a guinea from John Sullivan, a chief commander, it says in the list. Sullivan was, of course, adjutant general of the Jacobite army, an Irishman with French experience who'd come over with Charles Edward. And then, and I quite like this, he publicly insulted the well-affected people in Trinent. So he was pretty obnoxious to his neighbours, I think, in the wake of the Jacobite victory, and vaunted of his being a sergeant in the rebel artillery, and continuing with them until dispersed in the wake of Culloden. Now, I haven't been able to verify much of this information from other sources as yet, but it does sound like he was somewhat of an interesting character, perhaps didn't get on too well politically with many of his neighbours, and perhaps that in itself tells us something about the political leanings of the community up there in Trinent. He is said in the list to be lurking or to be got into England. And again, I haven't yet found anything that I can convincingly say proves that he comes back, but I haven't found him in the prisoner lists either. But an interesting potential story. And of course, the Jacobite army, I should say, didn't have an artillery train until the Battle of Prestonpans, and then it captured the artillery train of the British army and took it back to Edinburgh and spent the next few weeks learning what to do with it and reorganising it and so on. So an opportunity in which somebody, if they might have had some experience or skills, might have been able to get involved then. Of course, according to the list of persons concerned, though, it seems to be suggested that he himself was the best source for him being a sergeant in the artillery. The next person I want to turn to is Robert Anderson. Now, he's perhaps the most famous local Jacobite and deserves a bit of attention, although precisely how you're defining local is an interesting one in his case. Let's have a look at him. Now, despite being a very important character in the story of the Battle of Prestonpans, Robert Anderson is a little bit obscure in his personal history. He is from Whitborough, which is in Midlothian, and it's just out of our area, so some distance from the battlefield. But he is part of the large, extended Anderson family, which has estates and connections all over East Lothian, particularly the Andersons of Windyghoul here, Windyghoul on the south side of the ridge on which Trinent sits. And Andersons from here had been out in 1715, and Charles Edward, according to some sources, even popped in for a glass of wine on the 20th of September and complimented the Anderson ladies. Now, Robert Anderson certainly, therefore, even if by actually where he lives he's outside of our local area, certainly has family connections in the area and spent time here. He's familiar with the landscape. He's familiar with the area around Riggin Head, for example, there, which was leased at various points by Andersons. And so he is able, on the evening of the 20th of September, to inform the Jacobites that there is this route from their position at Trinent round past Riggenhead Farm to bring them out onto the field of battle to the eastern side of General Cope's positions. So that information that's given by Anderson is very important. He initially gives it to James Hepburn of Keith, who's from just a few miles along the road as well, so a neighbour and connector in that part of the story too, and then subsequently to Lord George Murray, and then from him to the Prince. Often when this is boiled out into secondary accounts, or indeed into fictionalised accounts of the campaign, Robert Anderson is reduced to being some helpful yokel local who comes along with information of how to get through the marshes. The reality is, of course, as I've indicated, he was very well connected. He was a gentleman farmer. of some status, and he was a committed Jacobite who joined the prince's army in Edinburgh and who served on the quartermaster's staff. So he was not an insignificant man, and when he had information to give, it was clearly listened to. He does seem to have escaped after the campaign. As I say, the details of his life are a little bit obscure, as far as I can tell so far, at least. So the network of the Andersons may give us a first real hint to the sorts of gentry that Alexander Carlyle was talking about as being potential Jacobite sympathisers. Leaving the gentry aside, though, as we come back into Prestonpans, William Brown is accused first of getting involved with the collection of the salt duties, which is how he was employed initially anyway, but then subsequently joining the Duke of Perth's regiment, perfectly plausible, as the regiment was certainly recruiting in Edinburgh and the Lothians in the aftermath of the battle. He's then held prisoner in Haddington after the war. It says he's absconded on their going for England. So perhaps he deserted the Jacobite army because, as I say, he's held in Haddington rather than being held, at Carlisle or York or Edinburgh. And it is potentially evidence that he was caught trying to work his way home. Anyway, he was discharged in the summer of 1746 and doesn't seem to have suffered too badly from his flirtation with the Jacobite army. It's likely, considering the period in which he is likely to have actually campaigned, that he hadn't actually contributed a great deal to the military outcomes of the fortunes of the Jacobites. John Dick is an interesting character, though. Let's spend a little time with him. He was accused also of joining the Jacobites on their march into England and was subsequently captured and taken to Edinburgh. What do we know about John Dick? So we've been going through local records and trying to flesh out John Dick, pun intended, and we think he might be the son of the William Dick, a butcher who died in 1731, ironically enough, on the 21st of September. And perhaps, therefore, also the brother of Alexander Dick, the butcher, who died in January 1742. And although we're drawing inferences from a relatively thin amount of information, perhaps these are a succession of deaths which left it very difficult for John Dick to make the business profitable. Certainly, he seems to have been having a hard time by the beginning of 1745 when he's ordered before the Kirk session, accused of allowing his children to beg in the street. He's also accused, and he denied all this, and it's not for me to cast judgment, of course, at this distance in time, of beating his wife, of swearing and cursing, and of breaking his neighbours' windows. What seems to be the case is that John Dick, for whatever reasons, was having a tough time of it by the summer of 1745, was not getting on with his neighbours, was not in the good graces of his minister, was perhaps suffering economically, as his children being out on the streets begging would clearly suggest. Is it possible, then, that John Dick's connection to the Jacobite army is based on his personal circumstances far more than it is on any political support for the Jacobite cause? Now, we can't prove that one way or the other, but it's certainly possible for us to look at a man in his situation and think that all of a sudden the appearance of a victorious Jacobite army offers something of a way out. Of course, that proves to be illusory for poor old John Dick. He is captured and imprisoned at Edinburgh Castle. I haven't been able to pick him up much beyond that point. But an interesting story and one which we will continue to try and investigate as our researchers continue, potentially indefinitely. If we come back to our list of names, then we're left really only with one to consider, and that is James Dods, the tenant farmer. And he does deserve a little bit of extra space. Let's have a look at James. James Dods, son of James Dods, originally from Belton on the other side of East Lothian. James's father leases the farmland connected to Seaton Hill Farm near Longnidrey. So that includes area of farming around the house itself, of course, but it also, according to James Dods' own testimony, includes the ground on which the battle was actually fought. So even though he's living at a little distance from the battlefield on the other side of Longnidrey, certainly he's intimately connected with the area. Another interesting point here is that he is well within the parish of Gladsmuir, and so we've spoken often here at the museum about how the Jacobites called the battle Gladsmuir more often than they did not, and that is in part due to a Thomas the Rhymer prophecy that on Gladsmuir by the sea shall the battle be. But actually, the parish of Gladsmuir does come right up to the eastern fringe of the battlefield. So, if you'd have asked somebody like James Dods, who farmed that land, where the battle had been fought, Gladsmuir makes a little bit more sense to him, perhaps, than, for example, Prestonpans, which was further away from his part of the battlefield. Anyway, I distract myself. He was a gentleman farmer. He is accused of joining Balmerino's lifeguards. That's another reference to the lifeguards. Let's pick that up again. Another one of these elite troops of cavalry in the Jacobite army, uniformed and as I say, associated with wealthy gentlemen, uniformed, gold-laced hats, blue coats and red turnbacks, tartan carbine belts, all looking very smart. He's also suggested that he stays with the army right the way through until the aftermath of Culloden, and a suggestion even that he served as a clerk in the Jacobite army as well, so a man with responsibilities too. After Culloden, he was captured. He was transferred on the ship the Waldegrave to Tilbury Fort down on the Thames, and anyone who's done any reading on the conditions that men like him would have had to have endured will shudder at the prospect of him stuck on those ships where conditions were so poor and disease so rife that the governor of the fort didn't even want them to be disembarked and put into his care. So what more than this can we tell about James Dods? Well, the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that he denied being a Jacobite at all. Now, that's not unusual at all, and not surprising that many people who were subsequently captured by the government attempted to put distance between themselves and any evidence of them being actual Jacobites. Dods's claim was that first his horses were stolen by the Jacobite army, that he went off to get them, and having met up with the Jacobites at Kelso, he was seized and forced to accompany the Jacobite army not only on the march to Derby and the retreat from Derby, but all through the period of the Battle of Falkirk, the Siege of Stirling, and the Battle of Culloden subsequently, and it was only then that he got caught, or as he might have had it, recovered and released. Now, he called upon being a gentleman of some means and literate, and although he'd drawn the lot for transportation, he called upon testimony to support his character, and he got some pretty important statements. He got Robertson, the minister from Gladsmuir Church, to send a statement in his support, and George Buchan, his landlord. Buchan says, and it's his text that we see in the middle there, that to my knowledge and that of all the neighbourhood, he did from his entering to the said farm behave himself soberly and virtuously, and regularly attended worship and gained communion with the established church. The Jacobites violently carried away many horses from Seaton Hill and adjacent farms, which obliged him to follow them in his quest for his horses to Kelso. He was then pressed into their service and forcibly detained by them until the Battle of Culloden. William Robertson says almost exactly the same things. Now, I've mentioned Robertson before, no friend of the Jacobites, of course, but here he is in defence of his parishioner who's taken after Culloden. He was sober, discreet, and peaceable, regularly attended the established church. As to his behaviour since the 21st of September, the date of the Battle of Prestonpans, I can say nothing, having left the kingdom after the victory gained by the rebels at Preston. But as I am certainly informed, he never openly joined them during their stay in Scotland. Perhaps unhelpfully, George Buchan in his letter also says the same thing. What he actually did after the Battle of Prestonpans, I don't know, because I wasn't there. I also moved to England to get out of the way. And so they can't actually, apart from giving their character statements and reporting secondhand that he didn't get involved voluntarily, they can't actually prove it. We also have in the National Archives in London James Dods' own testimony in his defence. You can see it here, and he basically, in this short letter, explains everything we've heard so far. He went in pursuit of his horses. He was then forcibly detained by the Jacobites, despite having never had any anti-government feelings whatsoever, and having proactively helped prepare the community to defend itself against the Jacobites. He concludes by saying, "In consideration whereof and of your petitioner's wife and children, who must become beggars if he is transported, your petitioner humbly prays he may be permitted to return home, where he will remain a quiet and peaceable subject, and shed the last drop of his blood in his Majesty's service." Now that's a pretty moving piece of testimony, and it's difficult for us to say at this distance in time whether or not it's fair and truthful. I must say, for my own part, I find it slightly unlikely that he would have taken the risk, having not moved in the days or weeks previously, before the Jacobites' army moved out of the local area, of going all the way down into the borders to Kelso in search of his missing horses. And I also find it slightly implausible that the Jacobites went to the effort of detaining him all the way through the course of the campaign, through hell or high water, during their long retreats through the winter, and of course through several military operations as well. I find that a little bit implausible, and when you couple it with the accusation that he is associated with Balmerino's Lifeguards, one of the elite regiments of the army, which is particularly attractive to young gentlemen and men of means, then you start to wonder where James Dods' horses were actually being employed, and I do have a suspicion that much of this protestation afterwards is an attempt, quite reasonably and understandably, to survive the penalties that are glaring him. And now, the other thing that's worth raising is the defence that's offered by the landlord, and particularly by Robertson. You might say that a minister like Robertson has no need to be defending Jacobites who clearly fought on opposite sides to he himself. But the reality is, of course, he's defending a parishioner, and in doing so is trying to defend his parishioner's family, and perhaps, as we sort of hinted at with the possibilities of not prosecuting any of those salt workers, there are efforts by people within the local community to try and smooth things out in the aftermath of the rising and avoid the worst divisions and prosecutions that could fall on their neighbours. How to treat evidence like this is, of course, controversial and difficult to state anything with any certainty. However, I do think this is a very interesting story, and I think indicative of perhaps some support on that side of the battlefield amongst some gentlemen like the Andersons and like James Dods. And if that's correct, then they fit into a slightly broader picture as well, because if we move just slightly up from Seaton Hill, where Dods and his family lived, we get, as I've indicated in that second blue circle there in the top right, to Red House. Now, Red House Castle was the home of George Hamilton, and Hamilton was absolutely a Jacobite. He was a captain in Bagot's Hussars, another Jacobite cavalry regiment of slightly lesser status than the Lifeguards, it must be said. But nevertheless, he was captured in the north of England during the retreat back from Derby, and he was caught with his commission, and so it was pretty clear that he had a position of responsibility serving in the Jacobite army. He was subsequently executed at York on the 1st of November 1746. He then had his head removed and sent to Carlisle, where it was put on public display. The Hamiltons subsequently forfeited, of course, and they lost their home at Red House. The line ended, and the ruins of that great property are now in the grounds of the Garden Centre, just outside Longniddry, and well worth a visit and a toasty. So this is a very near neighbour of the Dods, and I do strongly suspect they will have known each other before the Rising. And another near neighbour of both George Hamilton and James Dods was Andrew Porteous. Now, he's from Burnfoot, which was just outside Longniddry, and is now, in fact, incorporated into the village. And he, interestingly, was in Charles Edward's Lifeguards. So another cavalryman, another lifeguard. Now, he made no effort to defend himself either. He was put on trial at Carlisle, and he pleaded guilty and was condemned, although he does seem to have been subsequently reprieved after the government felt it had done enough to make its point with the prosecutions. So Andrew Porteous of Burnfoot, George Hamilton at Ride House, and James Dods Seaton Hill provide us with a little cluster of men, neighbours, gentlemen farmers, who all ended up in the Jacobite cavalry. Now, is it a coincidence? I don't think it can have been. These men must have known each other. Perhaps they were conversing and discussing their support for the Jacobites. Perhaps they made a collective decision even to join in the Jacobites. But they're all of a certain status. They're all in the cavalry, and maybe they're even riding off to join the cavalry with James Dods's horses. Now, perhaps once you've spotted these connections, you can be forgiven for indulging in a few further fancies, like the fact that both of the commanders of the two troops of lifeguards in the Prince's army have connections to East Lothian. They're Lord Balmerino down there on the left and Lord Elcho on the right. Elcho, David Weems, his brother has just inherited big estates over around Haddington, and it's from there, before he joins up with Charles Edward, that Elcho gets the money, which he subsequently loans to the Jacobite prince. Arthur Elphinston, Lord Balmerino, also has East Lothian connections over this western end of the county this time. Obviously, the family has long connections to Elphinston itself, but also Balmerino is actually listed in the list of persons concerned as an East Lothian or Haddingtonshire person, because his residence is listed as Mountain Hall, Monkton Hall, which is just over the Esk in the Musselburgh area, although he also had his principal seat over in Leith. So both Balmerino and Elcho, although not residents in this part of the world themselves directly, therefore being local to the battlefield, are certainly men with connections, relations, and potentially influence in this area. So let's go back to what Carlyle said, as we quoted at the beginning, that many people in East Lothian were Jacobites at the time. The commons in general, 2/3 of the gentry. Well, we have found the commons supporting the Jacobites in the area around the battlefield. Not in vast numbers, but they are there. Some of those are supporting in a sense of collaboration and support, helping to finance the Jacobite cause, whereas a smaller number are actively out there in the army, and of those, relatively small number again see it all through to the bitter end, so perhaps are joining for reasons other than a strong political affiliation. Nevertheless, when it comes to the gentry, although we've seen plenty of gentlemen that were clearly hostile to the Jacobite cause, we're also finding those that aren't. Those who are prepared, whether it's people like Dods at Seaton Hill or Hamilton at Red House, and Andrew Porteous at Burnfoot, and Robert Anderson on the quartermaster's staff, that are coming out into the senior regiments of the Jacobite army, if you can put it that way, the cavalry regiments, the lifeguards, in important positions. So we have got some evidence to suggest that Carlyle is not completely fabricating this assessment, although it's hard to draw out a sense that these numbers are vast. Which leads us to that final clause that he puts in there. They had no aversion to the family of Stuart. And this is the root of all studies of Jacobitism, really. In 1745, it's the problematic issue, is what differentiates support from sympathy? What is the bar which you have to reach before you are prepared to turn not having an aversion to the Jacobites to being an active supporter, prepared to risk everything for them? Now, I'm very much aware that we haven't formed real firm conclusions because we don't have large amounts of evidence for many of the people that we've been talking about. But I do think we've seen the emergence of a bit of a pattern, that out in the rural parts of this area, we're more likely to find gentlemen farmers who have a Jacobite leaning, whereas in the western parts of Prestonpans area, where we have the law lords and the more sort of urban men connected into Edinburgh for their livelihoods, we have a strong band of gentry supporting the government. Does this give us an indication of how the local area was divided politically in 1745? It certainly gives us an idea that on an area, a part of the country, which on paper at least looks like it is not a natural Jacobite recruiting area, certainly there are undercurrents of support that they are able to tap into. Now, as I've said a couple of times now, I think none of this research is over. We are going to continue looking at these people continuously to try and find more information, more collaboration, see if we can find things out about their lives before as well as after the risings. But we've come up with some interesting things. I haven't drawn firm conclusions, but I have started to ask myself questions about how this community was made up in terms of its political sympathies, but also questions about how and why people joined the Jacobite army or supported it. Were they ideological Jacobites, like perhaps Hamilton of Redhouse was, or like could John Dick the butcher in Prestonpans? Did they just see the opportunity as a chance to get out of a particularly difficult phase in their lives? These are all fascinating subjects. I hope you'll agree. We're looking forward to continuing our work well beyond the boundaries of this project. I'll finish with this final point. We have seen across the small spread of people we've investigated a number of different outcomes for the accusations of Jacobite support or sympathy. Some were able to return home without any further penalty, it seems. Some brushed with the Jacobite army and managed to get out before they did anything too serious. Others found themselves in prison in Edinburgh Castle. Some in the terrible conditions of the prison ships down on the Thames. Some were able to escape the country. Some were transported. And people like George Hamilton, of course, paid the ultimate price on the scaffold. But life does go on. And although James Dods, whether he was an active Jacobite or whether he was, as he claimed, forced to accompany the army during the campaign or not, his transportation did not lead to the beggaring of his wife and children as he had feared. We have found evidence that the Dodds family were still farming Seton Hill some decades after the Rising. Thank you very much, and we'll see you again soon.